All right. Good morning, afternoon, or evening, whatever time of day it is for you. This is the second lesson that I made for the secular support group that I've started out here in Kuwait. This is going to build a little bit off of the first lesson, addressing the 10 commitments and a few other aspects of humanism, as well as how we make decisions as humanists. We'll also dive into some other religions and how their doctrine can not be seen in the best light. I'm not going to waste any more time. Let's go ahead and dive into it. This will be humanist thoughts and decisions. We're going to break down the 10 commitments and decision making as a humanist. So these are the 10 commitments. They were brought up by the American Humanist Association, and here's what they say in essence. Our life in this world is our central defining focus. Each one of us is responsible for the collective welfare of humanity, of other beings, and the resources that we share on this planet. We value freedom, reason, and tolerance, and it's our responsibility to develop this heritage for ensuing generations. The Ten Commitments represents our shared humanistic values and principles that promote a cooperative and democratic world in which every individual's worth and dignity is respected, nurtured, and supported, and where human freedom and ethical responsibility should be natural aspirations for everyone. I'm going to break down each one of the 10 commitments, and we're going to start with altruism. Altruism is the selfless concern for the welfare of other living beings without the expectation of reward or recognition or any kind of return. The collective welfare of our communities and society depends on the welfare of each individual person. We, as humanists, should always seek to alleviate the hardships of others with compassionate action. By caring for others around us and lifting each other up, we reinforce healthy connections and contribute to the betterment of our community, to society, and the rest of the world. So the second of the 10 commitments is critical thinking. Every day we're bombarded with a constant stream of information, and it can be difficult at times to decide what's accurate and true. Thinking critically allows us to make sense of all this information and reason our way to good judgments and effective solutions to the problems we might face. Meanwhile, also avoiding pitfalls like rationalization or conformity or stereotyping. This process also forms the basis of the scientific method, which will open doors for the new discoveries through hypothesizing and experimenting, something that humanists hold very near and dear to them. Critical thinking is a skill that requires continued attention, practice, and reflection. It's not something you develop overnight. Exercising our minds to build these skills enables us to challenge biases in ourselves and in others, paving the way for a fair, open-minded, and autonomous perspective that fosters a friendly, multicultural worldview. So the next step is empathy. And empathy just means entering imaginatively into someone else's situation in an attempt to understand their experience as though we're experiencing it ourselves. Empathy requires us to step outside of our own perspective to consider someone else's thoughts or feelings or circumstance from that person's point of view. In many ways, empathy is the first step to ethical behavior, as it allows us to respond compassionately to the suffering or the harm that's caused to others and exercise good judgment when our actions may affect someone else. Understanding another person's perspective is not only critical to building better relationships, but also makes us better citizens in both our local and global communities. Empathy promotes tolerance, consideration, and compassion amongst every one of us. Following empathy is environmentalism. Regardless of our individual identities or thoughts, we all live together on the same planet. The round one, not the flat one that some people are convinced of. Just as we depend on the planet to sustain us with all its resources, water and oxygen and food and so on, this planet depends on us to be good stewards to it and take responsibility for the impacts that humans have had on it. Disregard for the large-scale impacts that humans have had on the environment has caused extensive harm to the planet's ecosystems. Despite this, humanity is also capable of positive environmental change that values all life on Earth. Each of us should acknowledge both our collective and individual mistakes and seek to repair the past, purposefully working toward cultivating rich, diverse, and resilient ecosystems that will ultimately benefit the planet as a whole. Next up is ethical development. The key to understanding ethical development is acknowledging that nobody is perfect or has all the answers. And that's going to be a big theme in the second part of this lesson. Ethical development is a never ending process that requires constant reflection and evaluation of our personal choices and the consequences they have on others. Fairness, cooperation, and sharing are some of the first moral issues that we encounter in our ethical development as human beings, and are often embraced intuitively. But each new day carries with it new challenges and new moral dilemmas. We should continually adapt and rebuild our moral frameworks with the goal of becoming even better human beings. That brings us to global awareness. We live in a world that's rich in cultural and social and individual diversity, a world with rapidly increasing interdependence, too. As a result, events anywhere are more likely to have consequences everywhere. We've seen that a lot in the past couple weeks alone. Global awareness broadens our knowledge of cultures and perspectives that are outside of our own experience. A true global awareness includes attention to both current and historical events, and acknowledges how we affect and are affected by the interconnected social, political, and economic systems that we live in. The end goal of global awareness is global citizenship, which recognizes our personal responsibility to foster a healthy and dignified life for everyone in our global community. Moving on to something that a lot of us might know of and a lot of us might need some more of is humility. It means displaying modesty about accomplishments or talents or gifts or the importance of self. It acknowledges that humans are fallible and we have limitations in what we know and can do. Being humble isn't about having low self esteem or denigrating yourself, but at its core, it's robust self awareness. Awareness in our strengths and our weaknesses, our faults, our merits. It's honesty. It involves setting aside personal pride and overcoming our egos to embrace gratitude for what we have and appreciate others for who they are. Being humble, we realize and recognize our own value in relation to others. Inherently, we're neither better or worse than anyone else. The next commitment is peace and social justice. True peace involves an intense commitment to social justice and affirms the human rights and personal autonomy of everyone. Any level of injustice against groups or individuals signifies an existing conflict, even if the conflict isn't immediate or obvious. We attain peace only by consistently responding to injustice through thoughtful conflict resolution that aims to repair harms and ensure a fair and equitable society moving forward. This is called restorative justice. In order to attain a just and peaceful society, we all should take claims of injustice seriously and ensure that those who are impacted most by rights violations, especially, determine the best course moving forward. Speaking of responsibility, each day every one of us makes a choice on a small scale and a large. These choices, every single one of them, has consequences both for ourselves and the world around us. Moral responsibility involves taking conscious ownership of one's intentions and actions and being accountable for the resulting consequences. Even though we live in a society with various different cultural values and expectations, codes of conduct, and social norms, ultimately we all decide for ourselves what's right and wrong. Being a responsible person involves steadfast attention to what's right and willfully bearing the blame or praise of our own actions. And finally, the last one is service and participation. It means putting values into action in ways that positively impact our communities and society as a whole. It fosters helping others, increasing social awareness, enhancing accountability, and many attributes of the other 9 commitments. Engaging in service doesn't just make the recipients better off, but those who serve can develop new skills or experiences and personal satisfaction that all promote personal growth. We must all recognize that we're members of a group, and engaging in service to benefit that group and the other individuals makes us all better off in the end. So to piggyback off of the 10 Commitments, that was the most army term I possibly could have said. There are other organizations who have come up with similar rules, and I say rules loosely because I think most people have a solid sense of morality, whether or not it's rooted in a religion. My personal favorite are the tenets of the Satanic Temple, and they're here on screen. They're my favorite partially because I'm a card-carrying member, but also because they not only use these to help guide their way of life, but also promote acting against injustice and immorality on a larger scale. It breaks down the 10 Commitments in a way that makes sense and even takes them a step further. In fact, honestly, I'd argue that both the 10 Commitments and the Satanic Tenets can be agreed upon not just by atheists or humanists or Satanists, but nearly every other religion as well. And that segues into the second part of this lesson. Why harm reduction is moral and why religious perfection is not. This is a tricky topic because followers of any religion, theistic or not, can recognize this even if they still identify with their personal religion. I can't, off the top of my head, think of any Christian or Muslim who's followed and believed the Bible or the Quran perfectly down to the last verse. The same can be said for Norse pagans and the Havmul, Hindus and the Vedas, Wiccans and their Book of Shadows, or Pastafarians with the Gospel of the Flying Spaghetti Monster. I personally consider this a good thing, because most of those religions, especially the older ones, those texts have various themes or verses in them that just weren't prepared for the way the world would be hundreds or even thousands of years after they were written. Even humanists don't always perfectly follow the 10 Commitments. Why? Because we're human. We're fallible. We're not perfect. Except for this guy, he might be an exception. But on a serious note, I'm going to offer a trigger warning for this part of the lesson. I'll be pulling from various religions' holy books some different verses that, at the very least, aren't exactly the most appealing. And that's putting it lightly. I'll get to the point of that soon, but I want to start off by defining perfection and how we're going to be using it moving forward. So Oxford Languages defines perfect as having all required or desirable elements, qualities, or characteristics, as good as it is possible to be. Other definitions include things like flawless, having supreme excellence, or to a point where no improvements could be made. The slightly ironic issue with those definitions is that perfection is entirely subjective. What's perfect to you may not be perfect to me. If I get a 100 out of 100 on a college essay, a perfect score, another professor might give it a 98 out of 100 because I used an Oxford comma. This leads billions of people around the world to conclude that perfection in reality just can't exist, to say that it's ultimately impossible to achieve. But a lot of them, in the same breath, will say that there does exist something that's perfect. That's their God or gods. Not every religion claims this. In fact, most of the pagan religions often tell stories about fallible gods, mighty beings or deities who make mistakes and own it. But this idea of perfection, of perfectly following the words of a higher power, can cause some problems, whether it be on a moral ground or even a legal one. Before we dive in, this is not to dismiss an entire religious text. Every one that I'm about to show you has a plethora of inspiring, encouraging, and otherwise positive verses or stanzas. The verses I've chosen are simply to show that perfectly following a religion is impossible, especially when trying to live a moral and ethical life. Keep in mind these examples will be in a literal context as they are written. We can alter them slightly if need be, but they'll otherwise be referred to verbatim. So let's get into it. So I'm going to start from what people might not know as much and build our way up to more common texts. But the first is going to be the Havmul from Norse mythology. Havmul translates to sayings of the High One, and it's believed to be the word of Odin speaking wisdom through poetry. It's believed to be dated around the 9th or 10th century in Norway, and a lot of it is inspiring and insightful. Stanza 22, for example, makes note to not be self-centered and negative just because you can be. Other parts are mythological stories, like Odin hanging from Yggdrasil to learn the magic of the runes. But there are some parts of it that simply can't apply to modern life in legal and ethical ways. Havmul stanza 38 says, "Let a man never stir on his road a step without his weapons of war. For unsure is the knowing when need shall arise of a spear on the way without." Essentially, keep that thing on you. While it sounds encouraging to always be prepared no matter what, but the stanza is referring directly to weapons of war. From both a legal and an ethical standpoint, this can't always be followed. Would you bring a spear, or in the 21st century, a firearm, to a bar or a school? There's a time and place for weapons, and always carrying one just simply isn't possible. Stanza 83 is a little more to the point, saying that the speech of a maiden should no man trust, nor the words which a woman says, for their hearts were shaped on a whirling wheel, and falsehood fixed in their breasts. Doesn't sound very egalitarian if you ask me. Excluding someone just because of their sex or gender is prejudice at best, and something that directly goes against so many values that so many people share, both religious and not. And that includes Norse pagans. While I can't speak for everyone, the Norse pagans who I've interacted with are some of the most respectful people I've ever met, and would never think once about disrespecting someone based on something they physically can't help. For them, it's physically impossible to consider following a verse like that. Let's move on. So next up, we're going to be talking about LaVey Satanism and the Satanic Bible. The Satanic Bible was published in 1969 by Anton LaVey, the founder of the Church of Satan. Not to be confused with the Satanic Temple. They are two totally different entities. LaVey played a really big role in the Satanic Panic in the 80s and 90s, with most of the controversy coming just from his brand and label as a Satanist. The Satanic Bible included the 11 Satanic rules of the earth. Same thing as before, some of these rules are pretty nice and would actually fall neatly alongside of humanist morals. The 5th rule of the earth says to not make unwanted sexual advances, and the 9th rule of the earth says not to harm children. There is some positivity that can be drawn, even from something deemed controversial. There are a couple rules, though, that aren't as ethical as the others. And that starts with the 1st rule of the earth. Do not give opinions or advice unless you are asked. This one can go either way, as it's important to respect another person's boundaries, especially if you're in a new environment. That being said, presenting this to primarily a military audience, most of us go to the gym here. Would you give advice to someone who's about to bench press or deadlift with a form that could potentially hurt them or cause some injury? It'd be morally the right thing to do, as it's preventing harm that you have the ability to help prevent. What about when a new soldier enters your unit? Is it your responsibility as a leader to offer advice on whatever path they want to take? Withholding information can ultimately benefit someone else is unethical and frankly just rude. Both the 4th and the 11th rules say, quote, to destroy anyone who annoys you and to treat them cruelly and without mercy. It's a bit extreme, right? That's not acting compassionately to others at all, despite whatever annoyances they might cause. We can infer a lot from the verbiage used, but it begs the question, what average everyday encounter warrants you destroying someone in any fashion? It should go without saying, but that isn't morally appropriate in any way. The last one's really subjective and isn't necessarily harmful by itself, depending on how the individual uses it. Personal beliefs on their own can only cause harm to the person who believes them, so long as they don't affect anyone else. The seventh rule says to acknowledge the power of magic if you have employed it successfully to obtain your desires. If you deny the power of magic after having called upon it with success, you will lose all you have obtained. If someone wants to believe in magic, go for it. That doesn't fall in line with my views, but that's okay. You do you. I'm not here to try and convert you in any kind of way. The only way that it can potentially be harmful is if the person who believes the magic is going to grant them some otherwise impossible feat. Suddenly waking up to $1 million or casting a hex on someone else. Once magic is suddenly not delivering the intended result or causes them to question the effectiveness of it, this rule of the earth can internally tear someone apart with fear of losing all they've obtained. It's a painful path to go down when you lose faith in something you genuinely believe. Losing that part of you can potentially cause a lot of harm to the believer. Again, belief in itself isn't harmful, but the consequences of it can be. All right, moving on to some more well-known religions. We're going to talk about Islam and their holy book, the Quran. This one will obviously be a little controversial, given that I gave this lesson in an Islamic country and the history that Americans especially and other joint forces have had with Islamic-based groups in the last 20 years. Nevertheless, let's get into it. Surah 2, verse 223 says, "Your wives are your tilth. Go then into your tilth as you wish." Interpret that as you will, but the message is pretty clearly claiming that women are simply property to the man. Treating women as property, or any human for that matter, is unjustifiable by any measure, no matter if it's painted under a religion or not. The thing is, this isn't the only verse that puts women beneath a man in the Quran. Surah 2:282 says that a man's testimony to a crime or a breaking of a contract is worth twice as much as a woman's. Surah 2:228 explicitly states that men have a degree above the women, as Allah commands. Just from those verses alone, you can see some attempted justification of discrimination, but it doesn't fall very well, and it doesn't get better from here. There's verses that specifically direct followers of Islam to react uncompassionately or even violently towards other religions, specifically Jews and Christians and pagans. So, basically every other religion except Islam. Surah 5:51 says, "Do not take the Jews and the Christians as your allies. They are allies of each other, and among you he who takes them for allies shall be regarded as one of them. Allah does not guide the wrongdoers." It's not very welcoming, is it? Surah 9:5 goes a step further, saying that once the sacred months have passed, kill the polytheists wherever you find them. Capture them, besiege them, and lie in wait for them on every day. This verse attempts some form of moral redemption, ending with, "But if they repent, perform prayers, and pay alms tax, then set them free. Indeed, Allah is all-forgiving, most merciful." I don't know about you, but a God who demands the death of anyone with a different belief and is then proclaimed to be the most merciful seems contradictory at best. It's nearly as aggressive towards atheists, with Surah 973 and 74 saying that hell will be the unbelievers' domain and that Muslims should strive against the unbelievers, being severe to them, or in other words, starting jihad against them. There isn't much room for criticism on this matter either. Surah 693 says, "And who is more unjust than one who invents a lie about Allah?" It then goes on to describe their souls being discharged and extreme humiliation being presented to them by angels because of their arrogance. This verse seems really specific to lying about the Islamic interpretation of God, but what happens when someone makes a valid argument against, say, the verses before this one? They aren't lying, but it may come across as lying to someone who only sees Islam as a religion of peace, as so many like to say. And this brings me to probably the most familiar book on this list. That's Christianity's Bible. The real difficulty with dissecting this one is the fact that there's currently over 3,000 different translations of the Bible, with over 100 alone being in English. This might change some words here and there, like evil to calamity, like in Isaiah 45:7, or oxen to unicorn, like in Psalm 22:21. But for the most part, the message remains the same no matter what version you use. I've personally spent a lot of time deconstructing from Christianity, and I found a plethora of reasons I disagree with it, from not just a theological standpoint, but a moral one too. Verses like John 3:16 and Jeremiah 29:11 might seem nice from the outside looking in, but there's just as much, if not more, to find irredeemable about the Bible. Starting off, we're going to focus our attention towards children, specifically in Psalm 137:9, infants. The verse reads, "Blessed will be the one who seizes and dashes your children against the rocks." These words are spoken by Babylonian exiles, likely slaves at the time of the writing of the psalm, and they didn't hold the highest regard towards those in Babylon. Their way of venting was by wishing death to newborns, and it's believed to be promoted by Yahweh, or God. Numbers 31 follows a similar path, with the Israelites waging war against the Midianites and calling for the execution, in verse 17, of every man among the little ones, and every woman who has known a man intimately. Verse 18 takes it just a step further by saying, "The girls who have not known a man intimately, keep alive for yourselves." Just flat out calling women, especially virgin girls, trophies of war. It shows that to the Israelites, the true value of a woman was whether or not she had slept with anyone. It's dehumanizing and sick. There's verses throughout the Old Testament, especially, and some in the New Testament, that endorse the possession of other human beings. This is not indentured servitude, as some would like to protest. It's not some sort of temporary slavery where the slave is in question simply has a debt to work off. This was full chattel slavery. Leviticus 25:44 through 46 gives specific instructions spoken directly from God on where and how to purchase slaves, as well as the ability to give them to your children as property. Exodus chapter 20 goes a step further and gives specific instructions on how to beat your slave, stating that anyone who beats their male or female slave with a rod must be punished if the slave dies as a direct result. But they are not to be punished if the slave recovers after a day or two, since the slave is their property. It would seem that the Christian Bible is pretty clear on its stance towards owning another human, and that's not very promising. The New Testament isn't much better either, with 1 Peter 2:18 giving specific instructions to Roman slaves that they, in reverent fear of God, must submit to your masters. You'd think that maybe there would be a change of opinion in the millennium between the Old and New Testament, but it's clear that wasn't the case at all. It turns out that simply saying that you don't believe people should be seen as property is already evidence that the person saying that is morally superior to the authors of the Bible. And finally, there's a number of punishments in the Bible that are in no way supported by today's laws or modern sense of morality. From Deuteronomy 21 saying that a disobedient child should be stoned, to 2 Kings chapter 2 depicting bears mauling children for calling Elisha bald, to Genesis 3:16 giving the curse of painful childbirth to Eve for eating the fruit in the Garden of Eden, to the prophet and Messiah of all Christianity, Jesus himself, being crucified because he spoke out against the government. Yeah, I'm including that one. Crucifixions were a horribly painful way to go out. We have plenty of historical accounts of those. And the fact that they happen at all is mind-boggling just to think about. There is no explaining away how cruel that practice was. It would be absolutely insane if it was ever brought back as a legal method of execution. Maybe no verse demands it, but the thought of it alone should paint a clear picture where someone's ethical and moral compass points to if they were to, for whatever reason, take it literally and call for the return of crucifixion. Now, I'm not going to finish this off without pointing the finger back at myself, too. While the 10 Commandments are not orders or directives, they're simply character traits that we deem make a moral person, a few questions can still come up. I'm really going to sound like a pastor here, but bear with me for a sec. Is it possible to consistently follow all 10 traits perfectly? Is someone who lives outside of where they can keep up on world events less moral than someone who does? Is someone who isn't able to actively volunteer or give back to the world less moral than someone who can? Is it less moral to take care of yourself some days rather than those around you? Some might say yes, some might say no, and it's really a matter that's up for debate to anyone who wants to make it. So what was the point? I just covered some extreme examples plucked out of various religious texts. 2 of those texts I have personal experience with in their religion. And I did that 1 to make a point and 2 to bring us here. What's something that all of them, every verse, stanza, and so on, all have in common? I'll give you a second. Harm in some way, shape, or form is caused to someone somewhere. Whether it be to another person or to yourself, harm from all of those verses is caused as a result. We often forget that harm can be done to us too, through both our actions and our inactions. But at the end of the day, if you were to always consistently, 100%, follow word for word the tenets, commandments, scripture, stanzas, or even the commitments, eventually some harm will come. What should be viewed as the most moral thing to do is reduce that harm in whatever way we can. And humanity is already well on its way there. While some may exist out there, and I'm not including extremist personalities or groups in this statement, I don't know of a single Christian who actively stones people to death, or a single Norse pagan who mistreats women, or a single Satanist who seeks to destroy people, or a single Muslim that flat out refuses to befriend someone of another religion or belief. Each and every one of them who refuses to follow those verses that I named may not be following all 100% of their books perfectly, but they're making the moral decision to value humanity, diversity, and life as a whole over their religion. That, just by itself, is an incredible act of morality, and deserves recognition that even if there's differences between a group of beliefs, almost all of them can agree that preventing harm from coming to one another is the most important thing that they can do. And with that, that concludes my lesson. This is going to be the agenda for the next few weeks. Next week, we're going to go over the book Why There Is No God by Armin Navabi. He's a former Muslim turned atheist. The book covers a lot of different arguments and answers for why someone may not believe in any kind of God and why that's totally okay. Whether someone is questioning their beliefs or set in them in either direction. I think this offers a great deal of information on the position that atheists hold. On October 28th, in the spirit of Halloween, we'll be diving into the history of a couple antagonist characters in mythology, as well as sharing some information about the Satanic Temple. This was actually requested by someone who came to the Humanist meeting last week, and I think it's a great way to keep spooky season alive and well. Kicking off November will be an introduction into harmful dogma taught to mainstream religions and some ways to move past it and heal from it. We're going to start off by talking about hell doctrine, and then we'll keep the theme going by talking about religious nationalism and the negative impacts it has on society, as well as how to build away from it. As usual, I'm more than open to feedback on what you want to see or hear, and if you have any ideas, feel free to share them. But once again, that concludes my lesson. Thank you all for watching. I hope you enjoyed. Feel free to send me feedback, and have a good rest of your day.